Hello, it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Barbara Walter. I'm a political scientist, and I'm going to talk tonight about how research at UCSD is helping to influence U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East today. So this is a photograph of the leadership of CENTCOM meeting with Obama probably last year. The person in the middle is the head of CENTCOM. His name is General Lloyd Austin. And last December, I got an email out of the blue from General Austin inviting me to go to Tampa, which is CENTCOM's headquarters. By the way, CENTCOM, it's called Central Command. It is the arm of the military, the U.S. military, that's in charge of the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia. And Central Asia includes Afghanistan and Iraq. So when we think about what the United States is doing today in the Middle East, these are the guys that are in charge. So I got this email out of the blue from General Austin inviting me to dinner in Tampa, where they're headquartered, and to a day-long meeting after dinner the next day. And the email came with an attachment, and the attachment had a number of very, very specific questions that he wanted me to prepare for this meeting. I can't talk about those questions, but I can talk about one of the questions that he asked at this closed dinner the night before. And they hadn't sent me this question, so I didn't have any chance to prepare it. And the question was this: what aren't we thinking about? We, meaning the United States. What are we not thinking about in these regions that we should be thinking about? And he said, be honest. And I have tenure. So, so I thought, this is fantastic. And what I said was this. I said, the policy that we're pursuing currently in the Middle East is destined to fail. The policy we are pursuing is wrong. And there was silence. And so I said what I thought they were doing wrong. And I said, currently we are focusing almost all of our resources on one specific problem in the Middle East, and that is defeating ISIS. That's where all of our resources are going. And I said, ISIS is only one small part of a much bigger problem. The bigger problem in the Middle East, and the problem we should be focusing on, is not ISIS, but it's what's causing groups like ISIS to be able to emerge and to thrive. And that problem is the problem of civil wars in the Middle East. So this is a map that shows you basically where the violence and instability is in CENTCOM's region. There are currently 4 civil wars going on in Syria, Libya, Iraq, and Yemen. There is fairly consistent and fairly high levels of violence occurring in a number of other countries, including Iran, Saudi Arabia, Persian Gulf countries, Turkey. And if you talk to experts who study civil wars, like me, I would argue that there's a number of countries that are probably in the early stages of civil wars, like Lebanon, Jordan, even potentially Egypt. So when people like me look at this region, ISIS is not the problem, is not what scares me. I don't wake up in the middle of the night terrified about terrorism or about ISIS. I wake up in the middle of the night really worried about the number of civil wars that are going on and that could potentially spread. And the reason I really worry about it is because there's been, over the last 20 years, there's been an enormous amount of really good research on civil wars. And we now know what are the risk factors that cause some civil wars to be more likely to break out in some countries and not others. And just to give you a few snippets of what we know that if a country experiences civil war, the economic growth of that country not only plummets during the war, but for many years after the war. So political scientists, we say there's a whole host of negative externalities associated with experiencing a civil war. We know that civil wars make states that were politically and economically weak to begin with even weaker, again, not just during the war, but long after the war has ended. And we know that civil wars tend to create large humanitarian crises, and the refugees that we have been watching streaming out of the region are just one example of one of those types of crises. We also now are beginning to realize that civil wars create the breeding grounds for extremist groups. So Al-Qaeda and ISIS never gained a foothold in countries that did not have civil wars. ISIS was only able to form and to grow when the civil war in Syria broke out. So there is a correlation between civil wars, the ungoverned spaces that exist in countries with civil wars, and the emergence of these types of groups. And we also know that civil wars create what's called the contagion effect. One of the best predictors of whether a country will experience a civil war is if a neighboring group is experiencing a civil war. So what does this mean for the US? It means that the bigger problem is civil wars, not ISIS. It means that the longer these civil wars continue, the more likely they are to spread to a greater number of countries in these regions. The longer the civil wars continue, the more refugees will be produced. Again, this is destabilizing not just for the region, but also for Europe as well. And it means that even if we're successful in defeating ISIS, which is the goal that we are currently pursuing, the conditions that gave rise to ISIS will continue to exist. And even if we defeat ISIS, other ISIS-like groups will form. So what should the US do? The argument I made to them was that the US should focus on ending these civil wars and ending them in negotiated settlements. Now, lots of people tend to smile and think, oh, that's so idealistic. But we actually know that the outside community, that the international community, actually can have a large effect on helping to encourage negotiated settlements. If you look at civil wars over time, we saw a significant reduction in the number of civil wars that were going on post-1990, because that's when the international community began intervening to help end those civil wars. And so this could be applied to the Middle East, to bring Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, wars that otherwise will go on many years, to an end. This is my second to last slide. What are some of the basic things we know? We know that combatants are much more likely to negotiate seriously if there's a military stalemate, if they know that fighting is not going to deliver a decisive victory for them. We know that they're much more likely to negotiate if they are promised power sharing in the new government, right? We can do this. We know that they're much more likely to sign and implement a peace agreement if they know that the terms are going to be enforced over time. So is this possible in Iraq and Syria, which are the two biggest problems that the United States is focused on? I think the answer is absolutely yes. What's going to happen is, as these wars drag on, it's going to become increasingly clear to all the players, including the wealthy patrons that are funding these, the different factions, that they can put as much money as they want into those countries. They're not going to win the war. And that's when you're going to see serious attempts to negotiate. One of the things most people don't know is that in most civil wars, the combatants do eventually agree to negotiate, and in most of those cases, they reach and sign settlements. So civil wars are not these hopelessly intractable conflicts. So at the end of this, General Austin said, I agree with you completely. And of course, that's not a surprise. They're on the ground. They understand that fighting ISIS is just one small part of this larger problem. And he said, now can't you tell the politicians this?